Sarah Chen couldn't help but fidget with her pencil as she sat in the back row of her new AP English classroom. The familiar knot in her stomach tightened as she watched her classmates confidently discuss The Great Gatsby. It had only been 2 weeks since she transferred to Hamilton High, but it felt like an eternity of trying to blend into the background. Back at her old school, writing had been her sanctuary. Her words flowed effortlessly on paper, winning her 3 state-level competitions. But speaking, that was different. The words that danced so gracefully across her pages would tangle on her tongue, especially when all eyes were on her. Her stutter, barely noticeable in casual conversation, became her greatest fear in classroom discussions. Ms. Peterson's sharp voice cut through Sarah's thoughts. Since our back row dweller seems so invested in her pencil, perhaps she'd like to share her analysis of Gatsby's character. The teacher's heels clicked against the floor as she approached Sarah's desk, each step making the teenager's heart beat faster. Sarah could feel the weight of 23 pairs of eyes turning toward her. She gripped her desk's edge, took a deep breath, and began. G. Gatsby represents the American did. The word dream stuck in her throat like honey. To dream. Ms. Peterson's mocking echo filled the room, followed by scattered snickers. Really, Miss Chen, if you can't even articulate a basic literary concept, perhaps you should reconsider your placement in this advanced class. This isn't remedial English after all. Blood rushed to Sarah's cheeks as someone whispered, brutal. She caught a glimpse of Amanda Torres, the class president, shooting her a sympathetic look, but it only made things worse. Jessica Matthews, sitting 2 rows ahead, didn't even try to hide her laughter. Through the fog of her humiliation, Sarah noticed movement outside the classroom window. A man in a charcoal suit paused by the door, his expression unreadable as he observed the scene unfolding inside. But she was too caught up in her mortification to give him much thought. Well? Ms. Peterson's voice dripped with condescension. We're waiting for this brilliant analysis. Or should we move on to someone who actually prepared for class? Sarah's fingers trembled as she tried to turn to the right page in her book, causing her notebook to crash to the floor. The sound echoed through the now silent classroom like a gunshot. As she bent to retrieve it, a folded paper airplane landed on her desk with Speech Therapy 101 scrawled across its wing. Looking down at her notebook, Sarah saw her carefully prepared notes from last night. 3 pages of detailed analysis about Gatsby's persona, the symbolism of the green light, and the corruption of the American dream. Words she could write perfectly but couldn't speak aloud. Words that now blurred as tears threatened to spill. Outside the classroom, the man in the charcoal suit continued watching, his expression gradually shifting from neutral observation to something darker as he pulled out his phone and began taking notes. Ms. Peterson wasn't finished with her public display of dominance. She strutted to the front of the classroom, her high heels clicking against the linoleum floor like a metronome counting down Sarah's embarrassment. Perhaps, she announced to the class, her voice dripping with fake concern, we should examine why some students believe they belong in advanced placement when they clearly aren't prepared for this level of academic rigor. The teacher picked up a piece of chalk and began writing on the board. Requirements for AP English success. The chalk screeched against the blackboard, making Sarah wince. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, eager for the show to continue. First and foremost, Ms. Peterson declared, underlining her words with sharp strokes, is the ability to articulate one's thoughts clearly and confidently. She turned to face Sarah directly. Notice I said, articulate, not stutter through basic concepts. More snickers rippled through the classroom. Jessica Matthews, who had been recording the scene on her phone under her desk, could barely contain her glee. But Amanda Torres, the class president, stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Miss Peterson, I don't think. Amanda started, but the teacher cut her off with a razor-sharp glare. Sit down, Miss Torres, unless you'd like to join Miss Chen in demonstrating what not to do in an advanced academic setting. Outside the classroom, Dr. Martinez's grip tightened on his observation notebook. As the district's new superintendent, he'd heard whispers about Ms. Peterson's teaching methods, but seeing it firsthand made his blood boil. As a former speech pathologist, he recognized the devastating impact this public humiliation could have on a student. Back inside, Ms. Peterson was on a roll. She pulled up Sarah's recent essay from her desk. "Let's examine what passes for analysis these days, shall we?" She began reading Sarah's words in an exaggerated, halting voice, pausing dramatically between words to mimic a stutter. Sarah's carefully crafted analysis of Gatsby's symbolic green light, which she'd spent hours perfecting, was transformed into a mockery. Her thoughtful comparisons between Gatsby's pursuit of Daisy and the corruption of the American dream became ammunition for ridicule. The man in the charcoal suit had seen enough. He pulled out his phone and pressed record, documenting every word of Ms. Peterson's performance. His years of experience in education told him this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern of behavior that needed to end. Through her tears, Sarah caught a glimpse of him through the classroom window. There was something about his expression, a mixture of controlled anger and determination, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, this horrific moment would lead to something more than just another painful memory to add to her collection. The bell couldn't come soon enough, but Ms. Peterson wasn't quite finished. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," she announced as students began packing up their things. "Advanced placement isn't for everyone. Some people simply don't have what it takes to succeed at this level." Dr. James Martinez stood silently outside the classroom, his heart heavy with what he had just witnessed. As the new district superintendent, he had made it his mission to conduct surprise classroom observations during his first month, but nothing had prepared him for the cruelty he had just documented on his phone. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he watched as students filed out of Ms. Peterson's classroom. Sarah Chen was the last to leave, her head down and shoulders hunched as she clutched her books to her chest like a shield. He noticed how she wiped her eyes with her sleeve when she thought no one was looking. Moving carefully to remain unnoticed, Dr. Martinez began his investigation. He positioned himself near a group of students gathered by their lockers, pretending to review papers while listening intently to their conversations. "Did you see how red Sarah got?" one girl whispered, giggling. "I almost felt bad for her." "Almost." Another responded, "Peterson was brutal. She does this all the time, though. Remember last week with Marcus in the wheelchair?" Dr. Martinez's pen moved swiftly across his notepad. This wasn't just about Sarah. It was a pattern. He approached Amanda Torres, who had tried to stand up for Sarah during class. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I couldn't help but notice what happened in there. Does Ms. Peterson often treat students this way?" Amanda glanced around nervously before speaking. "Are you from the school board?" When he nodded, words tumbled out of her like a dam breaking. She told him about the student with dyslexia who dropped out after Miss Peterson made him read Shakespeare aloud for an entire class period, stumbling over every word while she corrected him mercilessly. She mentioned the girl with anxiety who switched schools after being forced to give daily presentations until she had a panic attack. Down the hall, Dr. Martinez spotted Jessica Matthews showing her phone to a group of students, the video of Sarah's humiliation already making rounds. His jaw tightened as he heard their laughter. Pulling out his own phone, he sent a quick email to Principal Roberts. "Emergency meeting required. 3 p.m. Concerning Ms. Peterson." As he turned the corner, he nearly collided with Sarah, who was hiding in the alcove by the water fountain. She looked up at him, recognition flickering in her eyes as she remembered seeing him through the window. Before she could speak, he smiled gently and handed her his card. "Dr. James Martinez, District Superintendent," he said softly. "And before that, I was a speech pathologist for 15 years. Would you be willing to tell me your side of the story? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is speak up, at our own pace, in our own way." Sarah stared at the card, then back at him, hope slowly replacing the shame in her eyes. For the first time that day, she felt like maybe, just maybe, someone was actually listening. Sarah rushed out of the classroom, her vision blurred with tears as she headed straight for the girls' bathroom. She locked herself in a stall, trying to muffle her sobs while checking her phone. Already, Jessica's video was circulating on the school's social media groups. The comments were a mix of sympathy and cruel jokes about her stutter. Meanwhile, Dr. Martinez was building his case. He sat in a library, reviewing years of student complaints about Ms. Peterson that had somehow been buried or ignored. Former students came forward, each with their own story of humiliation. Marcus Williams, a sophomore in a wheelchair, described how Ms. Peterson had made him crawl up to the whiteboard when the accessible path was blocked, claiming he needed to show more effort in class. Emma Rodriguez, now a senior, shared how Ms. Peterson had mocked her accent last year until she stopped participating in class discussions altogether. My grades dropped because class participation was 30% of our grade, Emma explained, her hands shaking as she showed Dr. Martinez her old report cards. But every time I spoke, she would ask me to repeat myself in proper English until I wanted to disappear. In the teacher's lounge, whispers spread about the superintendent's presence. Ms. Peterson sat at her usual spot, complaining loudly about standards dropping and students these days wanting everything handed to them. She didn't notice how other teachers moved away from her table, their faces tight with discomfort. Sarah finally emerged from the bathroom to find Amanda waiting outside. "I saved your notebook," Amanda said softly, holding out the spiral-bound book that Sarah had left behind in her rush to escape. "And I reported the video." Jessica had to take it down. Opening her notebook, Sarah found pages of post-it notes stuck between her essays. Messages from classmates she'd never spoken to. "Your analysis of Gatsby was brilliant. Don't let her win. We've got your back." Dr. Martinez was in Principal Roberts' office, laying out the evidence. Student testimonies, recorded incidents, varied complaints, and now today's video. The pattern was undeniable. "This isn't strict teaching," he said firmly. "This is systematic bullying disguised as academic standards." The principal's face grew pale as he reviewed the documentation. "I had no idea it was this bad," he mumbled, but Dr. Martinez cut him off. "With all due respect, you should have known. These complaints didn't materialize out of thin air. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" Just then, a knock interrupted them. Sarah stood in the doorway, clutching her notebook like armor. Behind her were Amanda, Emma, Marcus, and several other students, past and present victims of Ms. Peterson's teaching methods. "We'd like to make official statements," Amanda announced, her voice steady. "All of us." Dr. Martinez smiled, gesturing for them to enter. "Perfect timing," he said, pulling out his recorder. "Let's make sure this never happens to another student again." Dr. Martinez sat at his desk early the next morning, reviewing his notes one final time before the meeting that would change everything at Hamilton High. He'd scheduled an emergency conference with Principal Roberts and Ms. Peterson for 8 a.m. sharp, before classes would begin. At exactly 8 a.m., Ms. Peterson strutted into the principal's office, her usual air of superiority firmly in place. She barely glanced at Dr. Martinez, assuming he was just another administrator there to observe. Principal Roberts sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable as he shuffled through the stack of papers before him. "Let's begin," Dr. Martinez said, closing the office door. "Ms. Peterson, I'm Dr. James Martinez, the new district superintendent. I was conducting classroom observations yesterday, and what I witnessed in your AP English class was deeply concerning." Ms. Peterson's confident smile faltered slightly. "I maintain high standards in my classroom, Dr. Martinez. Not everyone is equipped to handle advanced placement courses. High standards." Dr. Martinez pulled out his phone and played the video of yesterday's incident. Ms. Peterson's mocking voice filled the room. "D to dream. The color drained from her face as she watched herself ridicule Sarah. "This isn't about high standards," Dr. Martinez continued, his voice firm but controlled. "This is about systematic harassment of students with disabilities, which is not only unethical but illegal under federal law." He opened a thick folder on the desk. "I have statements from 17 current and former students, all documenting similar incidents. Marcus Williams, Emma Rodriguez, David Chen. Each case shows a pattern of discriminatory behavior disguised as maintaining standards." Ms. Peterson's composure cracked. "Those students weren't ready for." "Sarah Chen," Dr. Martinez interrupted, "has won 3 state-level writing competitions. Her analysis of The Great Gatsby was outstanding. Yet you chose to focus on her stutter rather than her intellect." Principal Roberts cleared his throat. "Ms. Peterson, your conduct has opened this school to serious liability. Parents are already calling about the video." "The video that never should have been taken," Ms. Peterson protested weakly. "You're right," Dr. Martinez agreed, "because that incident never should have happened. You have 2 options, Ms. Peterson. First, immediate resignation. Second, you undergo comprehensive sensitivity training, attend weekly counseling sessions, and accept a probationary period during which every one of your classes will be monitored. Additionally, you'll write formal apologies to every student you've humiliated." The room fell silent. Outside, students were beginning to fill the hallways, their voices muffled through the thick office door. Ms. Peterson looked from Principal Roberts to Dr. Martinez, finally realizing the gravity of her situation. I choose the second option," she whispered, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Good," Dr. Martinez said, pulling out another document. "Because despite what you might think, this isn't about punishment, it's about growth. Both yours and your students. Sign here, please." As Ms. Peterson signed the agreement with trembling hands, Dr. Martinez couldn't help but think about Sarah and all the other students who would never again have to fear being humiliated for simply being themselves in a classroom that should have been safe. The aftermath of Dr. Martinez's meeting spread through Hamilton High like wildfire. Students whispered in hallways as Ms. Peterson, noticeably subdued, walked to her classroom that morning. Her usual sharp clicks of heels were replaced by quiet steps, her head slightly bowed. Sarah arrived at AP English to find her seat moved from the back to the middle of the classroom. A subtle but significant change. Ms. Peterson stood at the front, her usual commanding presence replaced by an unfamiliar nervousness. As students settled in, she cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lesson, I owe this class an apology," she said, her voice wavering slightly. The room fell silent, phones quickly emerging to record this unprecedented moment. "My behavior yesterday, and frankly for quite some time, has been inexcusable. Sarah, I specifically apologize to you." Sarah sat straighter in her chair, feeling Amanda's supportive hand on her shoulder. Ms. Peterson continued, reading from a handwritten note that trembled in her hands. "I've forgotten the fundamental purpose of teaching, to uplift, not tear down. Each of you deserves respect, regardless of how you express yourselves." The transformation was striking. Throughout the class, Ms. Peterson caught herself several times before making sharp comments, visibly working to reshape her teaching approach. When Sarah raised her hand to share her thoughts on Gatsby's character, Ms. Peterson waited patiently through each pause in her speech. During lunch break, Dr. Martinez held the first meeting of his new initiative, Inclusive Education Alliance. Sarah, along with other students who'd come forward, shared their stories. The school newspaper editor, Jenny Kim, documented everything, preparing a feature story titled "Breaking the Silence." Students speak up against classroom discrimination. Parents began calling the school, not with complaints this time, but with support. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's mother, offered to translate the school's anti-bullying policies into Spanish. Mr. Williams, Marcus's father, volunteered to conduct wheelchair accessibility audits of all classrooms. The most surprising moment came when Jessica Matthews approached Sarah after class. I deleted all copies of that video, she said, awkwardly shifting her weight. And I'm sorry. I never thought about how it felt to be on the other side of my phone. The day ended with a special faculty meeting. Teachers gathered to discuss creating more inclusive classrooms. Miss Peterson, sitting quietly in the back, took notes as Dr. Martinez presented new guidelines for supporting students with diverse needs. As Sarah packed up her books, she found a new note on her desk. It was from Miss Peterson, written in careful handwriting. Your essay on Gatsby's green light was one of the most insightful I've read in 20 years of teaching. Would you consider presenting it to the class? At your own pace, in your own way. For the first time in weeks, Sarah smiled in AP English class. Justice hadn't just been served. It had sparked a revolution of compassion at Hamilton High. 3 months had transformed Hamilton High completely. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as students, teachers, and parents gathered for the district's first Educational Equity Conference. Sarah Chen stood backstage, reviewing her note cards one last time. Ready? Dr. Martinez asked, appearing beside her. Sarah nodded, remembering how far she'd come since that terrible day in Miss Peterson's class. Her hands still trembled, but now with anticipation rather than fear. The spotlight found Sarah as she walked to the podium. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Amanda, who'd become her closest friend. Jessica, who now ran an anti-bullying social media campaign. And Miss Peterson, sitting quietly in the middle row, looking remarkably different from the intimidating figure she'd been 3 months ago. And my name is Sarah Chen, she began, her stutter present, but no longer a source of shame. And I want to tell you about how one moment of humiliation turned into a movement of change. As Sarah spoke, her voice grew stronger. She shared how the support group she'd started, Speak Your Truth, now had chapters in 3 nearby schools. She described the mentoring program, where seniors helped freshmen navigate academic challenges. Her words, once trapped by fear, now flowed with purpose and pride. In the audience, Ms. Peterson listened intently. Through mandatory sensitivity training and counseling, she confronted her own insecurities that had driven her to tear others down. Now she worked alongside Sarah to create a more inclusive curriculum. Our voices matter, Sarah concluded, her words clear and confident. Whether they shake or stutter, whisper or boom, every voice deserves to be heard. The applause was thunderous. Dr. Martinez beamed from the side stage, remembering the tearful girl he'd met in the hallway months ago. Emma Rodriguez took the stage next, delivering part of the speech in Spanish, with Sarah proudly translating, a skill they taught each other during lunch breaks. After the conference, Ms. Peterson approached Sarah. That speech, she said softly, reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place, to inspire, not intimidate. Thank you for teaching me that lesson. Sarah watched as students from other schools lined up to sign up for Speak Your Truth chapters. A local news crew interviewed Dr. Martinez about expanding the program district-wide. But the most powerful moment came when a freshman with a severe stutter approached Sarah. "See, can you help me find my V voice too?" she asked. Sarah hugged her tightly, remembering her own journey. "Your voice is already perfect," she replied. "Let's help others hear it." As the day ended, Sarah looked around the transformed auditorium, once a place she'd feared, now a symbol of change. Her stutter hadn't disappeared, but her shame had. In its place stood confidence, compassion, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't taught by teachers, but by those brave enough to speak their truth, no matter how that truth sounds.